Gloria Anzaldúa's essay, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, comes from her book Borderlands/La Frontera, The New Mestiza. Now, this book chronicles her life originating in the borderlands, the physical area of the border in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. But it does a lot more than that. I think for Gloria Anzaldúa, the borderlands is not only a physical area where two countries come together, but it always also represents a place where different spiritual, linguistic, and cultural ideologies come together. And sometimes that coming together is productive and results in a new type of identity and ideology, and sometimes it's violent. And sometimes it can be harmful and it can be a clash. But if we see the subtitle of her book, The New Mestiza, this really is a reference to the idea of mestizaje. Now, mestizaje originally referred to the process of the Spanish and other European conquistadores and explorers coming into the Americas, colonizing, and either by choice or by force, intermarrying with indigenous groups in the Americas. And the result of this process is a new group of people, a new sort of ethnic cultural group that is the result of European influence as well as indigenous and native influence, right? And the degree to which the European influence is seen and the indigenous influence is seen can vary by region. Um, and sometimes you have very strong commitment to indigenous spirituality, preserving language, and preserving the culture. And sometimes you see that the Catholic religion and the Spanish language predominate, right, depending on the region. But for Ansaldúa, I think she calls it the new mestiza. And that really takes the idea of cultures coming together, sometimes violently and sometimes not, and brings it into the modern world. And she's talking about Chicanos as a group of people living in the United States whose ancestry goes back to Mexico, but who do not see themselves as Mexican per se. Right? They weren't born in Mexico. They weren't raised in Mexico. On the other hand, they don't see themselves as fitting into mainstream American society either. And that really is what the new mestizo is. This sort of Chicano identity based on Mexican culture, American culture as well, but also in some way a rejection of each. Okay, and when she talks about language and language's importance to her identity, we really see, as she identifies the 8 different versions of English and Spanish that she speaks, that to some degree she is accepting Standard English, for example, Standard Spanish, for example, but she also wants to preserve all of the other nuanced versions of those languages that she's familiar with. And this can include Chicano Spanish, this can include working class English or slang English. And really, she does not want to see these versions of language disparaged, right? I think she believes that because they're so important to how she sees herself, to how she's grown up, that really you cannot rob a person of any version of his or her language. Okay? And we see that quote right at the beginning, after the 3rd paragraph, where Ansaldúa quotes Ray Gwynne Smith saying, "Who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war?" And really, historically, I would say that robbing a people of its language is very often a result of war, sort of acculturation, right? After maybe some dominant society conquers some other society, there's a process of acculturation by which the dominant society hopes to assimilate the newly conquered peoples. And I think that's something that Ansaldúa really wants to reject, and she really wants to distance herself from people who would have her believe that her different versions of English and Spanish and Spanglish and Chicano Spanish aren't valid. And really, when we look at this book, it sort of reflects all of the different influences that she has. And the book itself isn't easy to pin down. Um, it has elements of autobiography, of personal narrative, but also of anthropology, cultural studies, critical race theory, and linguistics. Right? So the book itself is taking in all of these different influences in order to create something new, just as the title, The New Mestiza, hints that it might do. So I really think that she's working in a borderlands on many different levels, and it's about the confluence of ideas, influences, and cultures. So I'm going to look at the essay a little bit. I'm going to read from paragraph 12, and I think this really sums up how these sort of different versions of Chicano Spanish and Chicano English originated. So I'll read it, paragraph 12. For a people who are neither Spanish nor live in a country in which Spanish is the first language, for a people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue but who are not Anglo, for a people who cannot entirely identify with either standard formal Castilian Spanish nor standard English, what recourse is left to them but to create their own language? And this really is, I think, where Anzaldúa sees Chicano identity as very unique. It's not like some of the other Latino identities, say Colombian, Cuban, Puerto Rican, because she's talking about coming from a place where the dominant language is not Spanish, having some familiarity with Spanish to differing degrees depending on the individual, but not having that be a dominant language or just an everyday language. And really, she's saying, because we are in a unique situation here, sort of socially, why wouldn't our language also be unique? Why wouldn't we create our own language? I'm going to look at paragraph 24 as well. And I think this highlights what I was just talking about. Chicanas feel uncomfortable talking in Spanish to Latinas, afraid of their censure. Their language was not outlawed in their countries. They had a whole lifetime of being immersed in their native tongue, generations, centuries in which Spanish was a first language, taught in school, heard on radio and TV, and read in the newspaper. And I think this is another source of Anzaldúa's aversion to the way people are treating Spanish, right? And nowadays, yeah, if you flip through the channels on your TV, you're going to come across some Spanish language channels, absolutely. But really, when Anzaldúa was growing up, Spanish was a language that was sort of looked down upon. It was considered a language that was not highly cultured, and it was associated with working class people in a very negative way. Even in my own family, I can tell you, for example, my mother in Southern California and my father in the state of New Mexico, when they showed up to school, kindergarten, first grade, speaking Spanish, or even pronouncing their names in the Spanish way, they would be hit with a ruler across the hand. Okay, so for example, you couldn't say, my name is Felipe, you would have to say, my name is Philip. Because there was a very strong push and attempt to eradicate the Spanish language, and it was considered by mainstream America un-American to speak anything other than standard English. Now that's a problematic idea because it's impossible to define what standard English is. Languages are changing all the time. But still, this was a very serious concern, and this is the context that Gloria Anzaldúa is coming out of. So when she says there on paragraph 24, their language was not outlawed in their countries, meaning in Latin American countries, she really is referring to the idea that Spanish was seen as simply wrong within this country, within the U.S. society. So I've got a couple more quotes I'd like to look at. In paragraph 24, so if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Which really, I think, speaks to the idea that Spanish and the different variations of Chicano Spanish and even English were not respected. Also, just because we're on the subject of Anzaldúa, I really have to point out that I cannot talk about Gloria Anzaldúa without talking about the aspect of her identity and her sort of social force behind feminism and lesbianism. And she was a self-described Chicana dyke feminist poet. That's how she liked to call herself. And really, in talking about her identity as a Chicana, I think that you have to also take into consideration the fact that she's looking at gendered stereotypes and she's looking at the gendered use of language and a sort of heteronormative approach to language as well. And really, she's looking to question a lot of these practices and to say that even though there is perhaps a dominant narrative that does not value her use of language, her gender, or her sexuality, she is going to maintain a firm identity and pride in who she is.